A breeding ewe flock can kind of be thought of like a lamb producing machine. For the machine to work properly, you need all the right inputs to receive lots of outputs, or lots of lambs. But as we know, most machines break down, and one of the places the lamb machine can break down is when the lamb dies. And there's two main causes of lamb death in Australia, and that is dystocia, so birth injuries, and the starvation, mismothering, exposure complex. We've used genetics in multiple ways to improve lamb survival, particularly on the front of dystocia, but it also can be used in terms of improving starvation-related mortalities, and particularly in terms of the udder and teat conformation of the ewe. I don't know about anyone else, but when something breaks down on our farm, my dad generally sends me to the shed to get some tools to fix it. Disgruntled, he also tells me to see if I can find a better attitude when I come back. So today, let me show you the tools of udder traits, the instructions to use them, and maybe even I can send you home with a renewed perspective on the importance of udder and teat conformation to lamb survival. I've been working on this project for over 4 years in the New England Merino Lifetime Productivity Flock. Here we have around 1,100 ewes, and we've measured them for udder and teat traits at 2 time points. Once at birth, along with our tagging and recording, and then once again at weaning. So what exactly are these traits? The first is what we call udder depth, and this measures the size of the udder in relation to the hock. So here, a score of 3 is considered desirable, where a score of 5 is considered least desirable because it's associated with higher risks of mastitis and also injury. The next trait is really important for lamb survival. This is teat size. So here we're really trying to avoid larger teat sizes, so those score 5s which develop into bottle teats and are too big for the lamb to drink from. In a similar light, teat placement also describes the placement of the teat on the exterior of the udder, and here again score 4s and 5s are considered undesirable because they're associated with the development of bottle teats. So from having recorded these traits over the last 4 years, we know that they show variation in the population. And my focus is genetics, and we love variation. But we want to know how much of that variation that we see in these traits are due to genetics. And that's where we come to calculate the variance components and their heritabilities of these traits. The heritability is just the proportion of the variation in the trait that we can see that is due to genetics. So we calculate the heritabilities of the traits at the 2 time points, and we find that their heritabilities are around 0.025, sorry. And what that means is that we can improve them through selection, and we can do it fairly quickly. The other point is, when should you score these traits? Practically, this is what farmers want to know. When's the best time to score udder and teat traits? So we have the 2 scores at lambing and at weaning, and we calculate the genetic correlation between the 2 traits. And we found here that the genetic correlation is fairly high, which means that you could score at either time point for purposes of ranking animals based on these traits. The problem is that if you only score at weaning, you sort of miss that opportunity to capture any udder faults that actually cause the lamb to die. So you sort of end up with this filtered data set. So our recommendation for the best results is to score them at lambing or close to as possible. We have some producers that are scoring at lamb marking. By this point, you're probably thinking, well, so what? I already record a whole bunch of traits on my animals. Does it actually affect lamb survival? So to do this, I categorised the ewes that I'd assessed into 2 categories, those with sound udders and those with unsound udders, where an unsound udder was any adverse level of the traits that I showed you. And I was really trying to calculate the chance of mortality of a lamb dying if it was born to a ewe with an unsound udder. And what I found was that lambs born to ewes with unsound udders were around 50% more likely to die than those lambs that were born to ewes with sound udders. In this flock, we had a large amount of autopsy data recorded on our dead lambs. So we're able to take this a step even further and be able to calculate the chance of a lamb dying from a starvation-related mortality compared to all other causes. And what we found that lambs were significantly more likely to die from starvation compared to all other causes. And they were around 3.5 times more likely to die from starvation compared to all other causes. And that might seem really intuitive to you, but up until this point, we really had no hard evidence to actually prove that. So that was a really important finding. So in this very brief session, I hope I've been able to show you that udder traits do impact lamb mortality. They're variable and heritable, which means that we can select for them. And we also have some accessible tools now available to you in the new version of the Australian Visual Sheep Scoring Guide. And we already have some of our best sheep producers recording these traits in their flocks. So collectively, I hope this is just another tool in the toolbox that we can use to reduce the amount of starvation-related mortalities and hopefully avoid an udder catastrophe.
Thanks, Erin. Certainly was a rapid-fire presentation and just exactly how we wanted it. Thank you so much. Just wanted to ask you a couple of questions off the back. I think many in the room would know that this is a really important area, but how many do you think would see it as a priority, as something that they should look at seriously?
I think from the results based on the mortality results that we had, it really surprised me even that the degree of how much it does matter to survival of the lambs.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely something that we should be looking at. And I think most producers probably do some degree of scoring based on udder traits, but maybe not to this degree. Or
So for the people in this room, how do they implement it practically? What does that look like? And then how do they measure it?
Yep. So these scores are now available in the new version of the Visual Sheep Scoring Guide. So all the information is there on how to actually score them. We find that we can score these traits relatively easily out in the paddock when we're doing our lambing round, so tagging, if you're going to do it at birth. Or if you are looking to score at weaning, scoring them simply in a casting crate has proven very effective in our opinion. So that's how I think I envisioned people could use it.
What led you to this area of study? What drew you to this?
Yep. So back in 2020, I was working as a technical assistant on the CSIRO research station, and we just noticed that we had a group of ewes that were lambing for the first time. They were maiden ewes, and we noticed that there was a huge variation in their udder conformation, and we thought, I think there's some genetic background to this, and I'd like to look into that a bit further, because we were out in the paddock having to intervene in some of these cases that these ewes couldn't rear these lambs because of udder faults. So that's really what drew me into this question, and I hope it can be useful to other people as well.
I think it really will be, and we are glad that you are here and that you are looking into it. Thank you so much. Please thank Erin.
Very much. How good is LambEx? How good to be back here. Awesome to be LambEx back on again. It's been a long wait, and it's awesome to be back here in front of you again. Talking about something that's relatively new. Back in 2017, I had the luck to be in that crazy state we heard about earlier, California, in Silicon Valley, and heard about the power that was coming in terms of artificial intelligence. I took a leaf out of Angus's book and decided to lead rather than follow. And when you lead, you take a few hits and a lot of punches in the nose. So it's been a long time to develop a technology, and we've made lots of mistakes, but hopefully we're getting closer. For about 500 million years, an eye or an eye-like structure has had the monopoly on seeing stuff. That's all changed with the opportunity to put cameras and computers together. Now we have computers literally that can see and interpret images the same as the eye can, and I guess what I want to talk about today is what that will bring to agriculture. Just getting from the Adelaide airport to here yesterday, I counted 45 different cameras. I probably missed a few. I was listening to my Uber driver. But They are everywhere. We're watched right now, wherever you're driving. We've got cameras watching us, watching what we do, and interpreting that image. There's not a human sitting behind those cameras. There's an artificial intelligence algorithm interpreting what those cameras are seeing. And so the beautiful thing about the technology that we're talking about, it's all being developed for other stuff. Often in ag, I guess for a lot of our history, we've had to develop our own technology. So we had to go right through the heavy lifting to develop that technology, whereas this is all happening. In fact, the GPUs that AI runs on were developed for gamers mainly, so we're not often you get to thank gamers for doing something for ag, but that's the way it is. And now things are moving so quickly. The gear that we're using today didn't exist 2 years ago, and that's going to keep going. And so you kind of in this space have to just sort of trust the process and trust that if you can dream it, you'll be able to do it. And that's the really exciting part. The cameras are getting better all the time. The gear that we've got available to us is getting better all the time, and you know that from just your smartphone and everything else, that how that's going. When I look across the paddock, I very much see it now, sense it soon. Whether that's going to be camera sensors, whether that's a temperature sensor, whether that's a humidity sensor, whatever that is, we have this huge information feed that's going to come to livestock agriculture, and I think that's a really, really exciting space. The opportunity to really supercharge our ability as livestock managers by leveraging this technology, which is being developed by other fields. I was at the grasslands conference the other day, and there's AI counting slugs, so we get camera sitting there counting the slugs, so you know when you should be treating those slugs based on the camera telling you that. And that's just that we're at the absolute tip of the iceberg, and trying to give you a bit of a sense of that today. So while that seems a little bit far-fetched and far away, the reality is it's right here, right now. So that camera sitting in Marnie and Ricky Lewis's place at Cavendish in Victoria. That's our latest version of it. It's monitoring a couple of mobs. There was 2 different cameras monitoring a couple of mobs and doing that while we are out here relaxing in Adelaide. It's busily doing that work and monitoring those sheep 24/7. To underpin that, we had to work out whether sheep look differently, and there's lots of us in the room probably know they do look a bit different. When you present this to a cow audience, they reckon they all look the same. But the reality is that facial recognition does work in sheep, so we had to prove that early, and the reasons for that will become obvious. About 5 years ago, we did a project with AWI and actually proved that the computer could pick the difference between individual animals. Turns out that the work we did then was pretty poor compared to what we do now. It was a very, and this field is changing all the time in terms of the algorithms we use. And a lot of it's being developed to monitor humans, obviously, and we're using those same algorithms and adapting them for sheep. Our first sort of process, or the first thing we wanted to do with this technology, was match lambs to dams, because we thought that's something I've really wanted to do my entire life, is to know if you look across that paddock, we can see which lamb belongs to which ewe by that behaviour, but we don't have time to sit there and do that all the time. Some stud breeders do, but at a commercial level, well, not all stud breeders have that time either. They're using DNA and other technologies to try and get that information, or some are catching at birth. But what I want to do is, or what we wanted to do is to use this technology to really empower the commercial opportunity as well. So bigger farms, not just stud farms, getting this level of detailed information, which we can't do with the current technology or the current labour we have. Because what we know is if we do go into those flocks and we have a look, there's a massive variation in the reproductive potential of those ewes. Some ewes are delivering a couple of 30-kilo lambs and others delivering one little runty 18 or 20-kilo ones, and we don't know which one's which. We can bring that twin bearing. We know they scan twins, we put them in a paddock, we bring them out and we wean them off. We have no idea which ewe has absolutely killed it and which one's just done a really terrible job, and some of Erin's work in that as well. Just massive opportunity is what we really want to capture, but there's lots of other things we can do with that technology as well. When I start talking about facial recognition in sheep, people often think that we're about to take out EID and remove it. This is not about that. This is about supercharging EID. It's about, because once you've got them in a race and you can scan their tag, that's obviously the best and most efficient way to do that, run them through an auto draft, all that great gear that we've got with EID. But it does mean we can see them at distance. You don't have to be 200 millimetres close to them to actually work out who they are, and you can look across the paddock. So the cameras right now at Ricky's place, Ricky and Marnie's place, that's a shot from a couple of days ago from what the camera was seeing. It's basically scanning around, so it's got a pan tilt zoom camera. It looks around the paddock, finds a sheep, IDs a sheep, goes in, checks out who it is. At the moment we've got tags on them, so it's doing digit detection and then moving to facial recognition. Works out who it is, works out who's it with, which lamb's it with, and then makes that match, moves away and does it again. And so through probability, through how often that matches with that lamb, we work out that maternal bond. And so it's doing that 100% on its own. A heap of 4 or 5 years of 4 engineers to train it to do that. But yeah, really, really powerful bit of gear. And I guess the opportunities are enormous. And that's really what I wanted to present today. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of start imagining what we can do. Because we are only limited by our imagination. If we can dream this stuff up, the technology is coming, and it's coming at pace, and it's a really exciting space for the industry. And I was talking on the career panel yesterday, and I think we've got 4 engineers who had no interest in sheep at all, but now spend all day looking at sheep and are really passionate about their opportunity to add value to a real industry and to the food industry. So we can bring whole new levels of skills into our game. I want you to imagine when you're driving down your farm laneway and you're not just you're looking across the paddock and enjoying the view and checking out those views, and any livestock manager is always looking at their animals and trying to work out, making sure they're happy and making sure they're healthy, trying to interpret the signals. So imagine that future where you've got augmented reality. So on your ute screen or on your buggy screen or on your glasses, you're getting a feed of information. So now you're a supercharged livestock manager because you've got a sensing. If this is not about sending CSV files to your computer that you have to open at night, this is about bringing information to where you are and where you work. And I think that's where I think the industry will end up. Things like what proportion of that mob are grazing, what proportion are ruminating, who's idle, who's lame, all sorts of stuff. Scoring udders that Erin just talked about, that camera can be doing that 24/7. So we can train it to do all these things, monitoring welfare. There's enormous opportunity there. That company's called Erin Smith. We split it off as a separate company from NextGen a couple of years ago, and we'd love to have a chat with anyone around that technology. It is literally ready to go now. If people want to be at the bleeding edge with us, we're looking for commercial farms to actually start doing this, and thanks to Marnie and Ricky for allowing us on for that last final test before we go to market. But yeah, I think the opportunity for cameras and computers together in ag are huge, and so yeah, lean into what this sort of stuff will bring to our industry going forward. And that'll do for me. Thank you.
It won't quite do. I've got a couple of questions for you. Just going back to the example that you used of Marnie and Ricky's farm. So you've got that camera set up, or you've got 2 cameras. How far does the camera see? What's the kind of range?
So at the moment it's about 100 metres, so as you'll see in a 4 hectare paddock, if it was a perfect 4 hectare paddock, as in a square, you could see every corner of that paddock. So it pan tilts, zooms in about 100 metres is what we can see at the moment. We've obviously got to work out how several cameras in a paddock or put them into smaller areas, so that's one of the limitations. It'll probably end up on wheels, I think, eventually, but that's not where it is at the moment.
You mentioned tip of the iceberg. How far can this technology go? I mean, it's changing all the time. It's just mind-blowing, isn't it? But what are some of the things that we could be seeing in kind of 10 years' time if we're seeing this now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's hard we're not very good as humans to predict out 10 years, but I think I'll be 100% sure we'll be welfare monitoring in real time those early indications of worms or an indication of lice or something else, indications of anything happening in that paddock. We'll get that alert way quicker than we will now. So we'll have supercharged livestock managers, I'm sure.
And the big question, cost.
So the beauty of this is you don't have to go per animal because all the sensitive stuff, we've done all that work, and it's really expensive in sheep because sheep aren't expensive enough to put one on each. So at the moment we're doing $4.50 per lamb to match. We don't know whether we should be able to make that cheaper over time, but that will depend. But yeah, I think it's because all of this gear is getting cheaper because of the innovation that's coming to us as an industry. It will just get better and better.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Mark. Excellent.
Hi everyone, fantastic to be at LambEx. How good is it? I'm really enjoying it here, so thanks very much for the organisers. Absolutely fantastic event. So I'm going to talk about genomics and genetics. Good afternoon, good chance for a bit of a snooze if you haven't had one yet, but I hope to keep you awake. So I am going to be talking a bit about, I'm going to be a bit cheesy actually and talk about green sheep and take you on a little bit of a journey in terms of how we can get to green sheep. And thanks, Erin, for introducing the concept of variation and for Mark for following up on that, because that's how I'm going to open with you and talk about the variation that's out there in terms of methane emissions at a sheep level. And as I was sitting on the tarmac in Melbourne to catch my flight here to Adelaide yesterday, I thought, they're telling me how many kilos of carbon dioxide my flight is costing. I wonder how much that is in sheep. So I worked it out. And this, for the first time ever, is carbon accounting in aeroplane terms, using sheep as an example. So, using the variation that we see in our Hamilton flock, where we have maternal composites, there's around about a 48 kilo difference in methane produced by the top and bottom 5%. Now, we haven't done anything special to this data, this is just the raw data. So there are differences in body weight and feed intake between those top and bottom, just a caveat there. But it's a massive difference in terms of methane emissions. 12 kilos for those green sheep per year versus 60 kilos of methane per year for the black sheep. And that's the top and bottom 5%. Now, my flight from Melbourne to Adelaide yesterday was pretty full. There were around about 200 passengers on the flight, and I worked out that this was roughly equivalent to 134 of those green sheep. And obviously, the black sheep were up the front enjoying the high life, because it's only about 26 of them. So, big difference there. And if you want to think about your, I suppose, cost in terms of flying in sheep terms, this is the way that you do it. So, the question then is, how exactly do you find the green sheep? And I told you I was going to be corny, so here goes. Where is the green sheep? And for anybody who has young kids or grandkids, you'll be very familiar with this book, which was an absolute classic in our household. So where is the green sheep? They're everywhere. How do we find them? We have to measure methane emissions. And this is an example here of how methane is being measured in the sheep industry. This is coming from my colleagues at UNE, so this is Professor Julius van der Werf, and the research project that they have going in collaboration with MLA, New South Wales CPI and others, where they're measuring methane in individual portable accumulation chambers. Now, this has to be at a massive scale for genomic selection. We need really big reference populations, or big populations where we're able to measure methane. So far, they have measured 6,700 sheep, with another 4,000 to come this year. Now, it is a really big, I suppose, exercise globally. So they're not the only ones that are measuring methane emissions in sheep. There are others doing the same thing. Let me see. So AgriSearch, for example, have got a massive program in New Zealand where they're measuring methane emissions, not just in sheep, but also in cattle and deer. Now, the picture down the bottom is showing you how we're measuring methane emissions in the dairy industry. This is known as the SF6 method, which is basically a tracer which, when the cow breathes or eructs the methane, it gives you a proportional representation of the amount of methane that is produced at any given time by that cow. And as you can see, the big advantage with that technology is that the cow is able to walk around and graze, so we're able to get methane and measurements at grazing for that individual. The downside of it is that it's an expensive technology. We can only use it in a research herd context, and, well, the cows don't mind wearing it, but it does look a bit weird, doesn't it? So, in terms of how we go about for genomic selection, whether it be in sheep, dairy cattle, or beef cattle, we first need to measure the trait. So that's why these different ways of measuring methane are super important. Then we have to develop our genomic predictions, and then obviously we're able to give you breeding values to make selection decisions. But the problem is, and certainly in the dairy context, we're not going to be anywhere near the numbers that Julius is going to be able to achieve with the portable accumulation chambers. So we need to look at predictors. So this is where there's a new massive collaboration that's just started last month, which is called the Cooperative Research Centre for Zero Net Emissions in Agriculture. This is providing a bit of glue between our industries, which is super important. And one of the areas where we're collaborating is in genomics. And I think that one of the areas where we're going to be able to get the most traction is to help each other with new technologies that can help to provide solutions to measure and get many more measurements of methane. Now let me just step through this with you. So there are sniffers and sensors, sensor technologies, which can help us to look at, say, feeding behaviors, rumination patterns and so on, their association with methane emissions. That's a super important strategy. There are also sniffers being installed in dairy farms throughout Victoria, which will already measure the amount of methane in cow breath. So that's a really important area. There's obviously our wearable devices, and this is what we use as the gold standard in the dairy industry to compare all of these predictors. One thing that is unique to the dairy industry is what we call this mid-infrared spectroscopy, or MIR. It's very close to NIR, and that's measuring, you put a light beam of mid-infrared light through the milk sample, and it generates an absorbance spectrum. That's actually quite correlated to methane emissions, so it is a really good predictor. Where I think is going to be the gold for us as livestock industries, and where we can do a major piece of collaboration is in the microbiome. It is the rumen microbes that produce methane emissions, and we have, I guess, a bit more than a hunch that there are some really common bugs that are responsible for methane emissions across sheep and cattle. So that's a super important area for collaboration. In fact, later this afternoon, I have a phone call with collaborators from Spain, New Zealand, and the Netherlands and Denmark to try and get something off the ground in this space, to try and identify a core microbiome that will help us to reduce methane emissions. There are other devices like the green feed, which is really popular in the beef industry, and that's how they're scaling up. But ultimately, one of the things that we have to do is to bring together these measurements into a genomic reference population that we can then use to develop prediction equations and make our selection decisions. Now, we think that, and this is really repeatable actually across the industries, that genomics can provide us a 20 to 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2050. It won't provide an immediate solution. So when Steve was talking this morning, I wonder if the curve is actually going to go, we pay for methane for a while with these things like asparagopsis and so on, and then genomics comes in and hopefully will mean that we won't have to pay for methane forever. So I do think that this is a really good potential strategy to help us with the situation. I won't go through this in detail, but what I want to say is that the methane emissions account for about 18%, agriculture accounts for about 18% of the emissions in Australia, and enteric methanes are a big proportion of that. Now, if you look at the other industries, currently, they are taking up the lion's share of our national emissions. But if we do nothing, then our size of the pie is going to increase. So we have to do something, because obviously the other industries are going and are doing things already, with solar panels, EVs, and so on. So if we do something, though, then it means that we can reduce our pie significantly. Methane is actually, I think, a really good example of something that agriculture can contribute very positively to this conversation because of its life. We may not be part of the massive part of the problem, but we are a huge part of the solution. So, genetics is cumulative, permanent, and a long-term solution. So it is a really good way of tackling the issue. We think that genetics will provide about 20 to 30% of the reduction in methane emissions by 2050, so it is a massive opportunity there. And I think the real beauty of genetics is that it doesn't really require any change in practice. It just means that we make a better choice in terms of the ram or bull that we use to create the next generation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank
you so much. A couple of quick questions. When are we going to get these breeding values? What can we talk timelines?
Good question. We already have a sustainability index for the dairy industry, which is our first approach, and that's breeding for improved feed efficiency, improved longevity. We haven't got the real methane breeding value, which is the breakthrough. I think that we're looking optimistically for another, I'd say, 2 to 3 years before the breeding values are there. So I do think we are on the cusp of it, but it's going to take, I think, a lot of effort to get over that line. So probably 2 to 3 is the bare minimum.
Okay. Collaboration you mentioned, it's key here, isn't it? Are we doing enough between industries?
I think that's this problem, we need to throw absolutely everything that we can at it right now. And I think this is exactly the right time to be having these conversations and taking action, because there are so many things that are in common between our livestock species that do provide, I think, a really good opportunity to provide, solutions for this, including the microbiome, the use of sensors, and obviously harnessed with genomics. It is an absolute game changer. And it provides us with that long-term solution. This isn't short-term. It is the way that we get out of it in the long term.
Love it. Thank you so much. Please thank Professor Jennie Pryce.
Thank you. And before I start, I'd just like to thank the organising committee for inviting me to speak to you today. It's indeed a privilege. Today I'm going to be presenting what is effectively a snapshot of the outcomes of the research that we as a group have been conducting over the past 2-3 years. Work which is focused primarily on alleviating the impact of heat on sheep fertility and thus improving productivity of summer joinings, but also trying to understand variation in heat tolerance between individual sheep and the impact that has. The work I'm going to discuss is a combination of basically on-farm adoption-focused research combined with intensive studies that have been conducted at the University of Adelaide's Roseworthy campus, as well as Sardi's Turretfield Research Centre. So I've divided today's talk up into 4 main components. First, I'm going to introduce the impact in very general terms and the cost of heat events on sheep reproduction and flock productivity. Then I'm going to talk about what we need from solutions to these issues and the impacts in particular of melatonin, orregulin, and vitamin A, D, and E drench. I'm going to talk about the financial benefits in very basic terms. And then I've also been asked to speculate on where to from here. Before I do that, I think it's important just to acknowledge everyone who's been involved in this project. And this work wouldn't have been possible without the help and the co-design of the 6 farming systems groups and the landscape boards involved. They've helped obtain the farmer groups, Farmers First, find the farmers and introduce us. The 36 producers and demonstration sites who have welcomed us onto our sites, guided the research again, and in many cases dealt with my naivety about how we can achieve things and what we can achieve on sites. The 20,000 sheep that have been involved in the project, as well, obviously, as the entire research team, which encompasses people from the University of Adelaide, through Sardi, through the Drought Hub, and further. So, I don't think it's a big secret, but we know that heat events challenge the ability of sheep to thermoregulate, and we know that this impacts their reproduction, either directly via changes in reproductive processes, estrus expression, ovulation rate, embryo survival, fetal growth, or indirectly via changes in feed intake and activity. Based on commercial data, we have been able to quantify the impact, and we know that each day above 32 degrees during the week of joining reduces lambing rate by about 3.5%. And I think it's worth just considering that 32 degrees isn't a particularly hot day in summer. So using BOM data from the previous 70 years, my colleagues from Sardi Climate Applications and the Uni's Engineering School, we developed a tool we could use to calculate the incidence of heat events across different regions in South Australia. And today I'm going to present data from 3 different regions just to give you an idea of the impact. I'm I've chosen these regions because they do have very different climates. So I've used the Eyre Peninsula, Kyne, the Mallee, Lameroo, and down to the southeast of South Australia, so Keith, which is traditionally what we would consider to be a cooler climate. And I've collated the information for an average year over the last 70 years and the hottest year. So the average year is in green, the hottest year is in orange. And based on days above 32 degrees, in an average year, the decrease in lambing rate is estimated to be about 13% in Kyne, elevating to 20% in the hottest year on record. There's about 11% in the Mallee, elevating to 16%, and even in the southeast, it averages about 8% and increasing up to 15%. If you equate this to a financial loss based on a $7 per kilo carcass, or roughly a 24 kilo carcass, and a $21 cost of production, this means that it's costing roughly, on an average year, $19 per ewe joined on the EP, $16 in the Mallee, and about $12 per ewe joined in the southeast. And this elevates to $29, $24, and $22 respectively in the hottest years on record. The good thing is that it's probably not all bad news. Like most in things in life, we can find a solution to this, and we need to think carefully about how we develop management strategies which can reduce the impact of heat on reproduction rate. It is very important to consider what they need to do. So in no particular order, it is important that we can reduce the impact of heat on the animal. So if we can reduce the oxidative stress, the stress on the animal, if we can work to reduce their core temperature so they can cope with the heat better. And again, we need supplements that, regardless of temperature, increase fertility of the animal and increase their fecundity. And alongside of that, we need supplements or strategies which improve fetal growth, so improve nutrient supply, blood supply to the conceptus and the fetus, resulting in bigger fetuses and hopefully more fetuses, which means more lambs born and better weaning rates. And the two compounds that we identified as being most likely to achieve all of this are melatonin and vitamin A, D, and E. And because this was, aside from the intensive studies, is focused primarily on producer work, we chose to use melatonin as regulin and deliver vitamin A, D, and E as a one-time oral drench. So what we have done over the last 3 years is we've delivered these compounds at joining or within 2 weeks of joining. And on every single site where we've worked, we've also had a control. So we've had to be able to replicate and demonstrate the benefits within site and across regions. So first, I'm just going to give you a quick summary of the impact of melatonin on reproductive rate. We know that if you look at all ewes, it increases the number of fetuses as a percent of ewe joined by 12%. If you just look at the mature ewes, the impact is a bit lower, it's 9%, but the impact and the positive benefits are much higher in younger ewes, so 16% in hoggets and 20% in ewe lambs. If you then look at the impact of vitamin A, D, and E on reproduction rate, we can see that the impact is lower but still positive, and again it follows the same trend. So we've got a 2.6% improvement in fetal number for all ewes, 1.6% for mature ewes, and a much higher response in hoggets and ewe lambs of about 5.1%. So I've done a fairly basic cost-benefit analysis, or return on investment if you wish. So I've presented the financial benefits in 3 ways. The first is the minimum lamb price that must be achieved to recover the costs of each strategy. The second is the increase in fetal number and hopefully lambing rate required to break even at a $7 per kilo carcass weight. And the third is return on investment per ewe joined based on the improvements observed. Again, these figures were calculated based on $7 per kilo carcass price, 24 kilo carcass, and a $21 cost of production, with the cost of treatments removed for the return on investment. So you can see here that the break-even price for lamb is $63. Treatment efficacy has to be 7.6% and above, which we achieved across even mature ewes. And return on investment is $11 per ewe joined for all ewes, $6.40 for mature ewes, and up close to $17 for hoggets. And for vitamin A, D, and E, again, the break-even lamb price is lower because A, D, and E costs only 50 cents. Treatment efficacy only has to improve by 0.5% in scanning rate to be beneficial, and your return on investment is about $3 for all ewes, close to $2 for ewes joined and for mature ewes, and about $7 for the hoggets. So now I'm just going to speculate on where to from here. I've tried to condense this. It's hard for someone like me who working in a straight line can be difficult, I'll honestly admit. Based on what we found out, we've demonstrated from intensive studies that in rams, if we treat them with melatonin during summer, we can improve their thermoregulation and we can improve their semen quality. That's merino rams. And when we join treated ewes with ewes, we increase scanning rate quite considerably. The second two interesting benefits which we think we want to work on further are the fact that when we have looked at melatonin and AD&E together, the effect has been additive. And the other interesting thing for me was that when we treated hoggets with melatonin at joining, but not before joining, we increased survival of their twin lambs when they lambed. So these are the two areas that we hope to continue working on across producer sites in summer of 24-25. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I hope I've demonstrated the benefits of the supplements and given you an idea of the cost benefit. Again, I would just like to thank the producers involved, the funding bodies, and of course, my quite large research team who are here today. Thank you for all your help so far.
Well done, Dr. Will. Thank you so much. A quick question for you. Did you see the pun there?
Yeah,
Did
good.
you?
Yeah,
Yeah. I didn't mean it.
I really appreciate it.
So weak. How far away is commercialisation to take advantage of the positive responses in ewe lambs and hoggets?
Well, the joy of both these compounds is they're commercially available already. That's why we chose them, is so that producers could just roll them out if they prove to be beneficial.
Right.
So they can buy them off the shelf either from SIVA through their retailers, or their oral drench comes from Compass Feeds.
So for
Shameless
everybody
plug,
in this room, what's the key message that you would to like to get across to producers in this room from the work that you've done and your findings?
I think the key message is that heat stress does have a big impact on sheep. That the temperature at which they start to struggle isn't as high as we think. So 32 degrees for me is massive, but for you guys from Australia, it's not that high. And that I think we can probably, based on what we've established, is there is variation between sheep in their ability to cope with heat and how that impacts their reproduction. So there is potential long-term benefits from breeding.
Yeah,
in that
fantastic. What is your accent?
Edinburgh, Scotland.
Edinburgh, Scotland. There you go. We've heard a whole array of accents today. I love it. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
I've been working on this idea for about 20 years now, which either makes me an eternal masochist or a very poor scientist who just can't solve the problem, or it's a really difficult problem. I'm going with the last one. Right? It is a difficult problem, but it's one we need to solve. I don't need to tell anyone here of the problems that we have with getting shearers on time, with the cost of shearing, the cost in human terms of shearing, and the cost of shearing in terms of animal welfare. It is a big problem. COVID kind of made it really stand out. But we've been thinking for quite a long time about how we could come up with a groundbreaking change for the industries. So for most of the industries that I look at around the place, we've got major changes that have happened in the last 150 years. The grains industry clearly going from scythes and, making bundles of hay or cereal grains together to what we have now. The grape industry, I live in the Adelaide Hills, people used to walk up and down rows with a pair of hand shears and a bucket, and now we get those grapes in at 2 a.m. in perfect condition, perfect Beaumet, perfect flavour profiles, quality's better, efficiency's better, cost is better, major change. And this goes for every industry: milk, all of the fruits, and so on. So where's the wool industry? I dug out a picture of the Tom Roberts picture, shearing the rams, 1856, 2024. Spot the difference. There is a female working in the 2024 one. That's the only difference I can see, except for the shearing, overhead shearing powered plant and the shearing device itself. That was a major change, and it was brought about by the guy on the $50 note. There's an Indigenous person on our $50 note that nobody knows about, and I certainly didn't know about. His name's David Unipon. He's a genius Indigenous person who was our Leonardo da Vinci, if you like, and he came up with the current shearing handpiece that we use. You know, the reciprocating linear handpiece. Brilliant. But we haven't made much change in this industry. We're still doing something we were doing effectively 150 years ago. So what's this idea? I know a lot of you will have heard either me talk or heard about this and wondered, what's it about and where are we up to? And that's where I want to get you to today, is just keep you up to speed with how it's going. But what is it? Firstly, it's not BioClip. We're not cutting the fibres with chemicals. In fact, we're not cutting the fibres at all. And that's the difference between this and robots and BioClip, is we're not trying to replicate hand shears. What we're doing is using a chemical injected under the skin which weakens the wool. And that weak wool is then allowed to grow out for a period of whatever you like, 3, 5, we've done it out to 10 weeks. Let that regrowth occur so the animal's protected from, you know, hypothermia, sunburn, and so on, and then use a machine which goes across the animal and breaks the wool. Now, we started with a hand piece that did that, and I'll show you a picture of that working in a minute, and then moving towards an automated system that not only removes the wool, like breaks the wool, removes the wool with a vacuum, flies those fibres. We're not dealing with fleeces anymore, we're dealing with fibres, which is what we actually are harvesting. Run that past a set of video image analysis tools, which we've already got, which will class the wool on the basis of micron, colour, stain, and so on. So that's the idea behind it. Where did it come from? We started knowing that when we feed a protein called zein, which is found in corn, we got unusual effects on the wool fibre. It grew differently, the length and diameter grew differently, but the thing that struck us was that it was really weak. The wool became incredibly weak. We did this in 2009, right? So we knew this in 2009. But we also knew you couldn't just feed sheep as a way of creating the break point. Because of variable intakes, you know, shy feeders and that sort of thing, it was never going to be a way to do it. We needed to be able to know exactly how the biochemistry worked that was creating that weak wool. And that's the breakthrough that we've made in the last 2 years. And it's a big breakthrough, because now we can target exactly where we want to hit. We know exactly what targets we're aiming for biochemically, and we've got a bag of what I call bullets. They're biochemical bullets, if you like, that will hit that target. Now, that's been a major breakthrough. The second breakthrough was, yeah, but if you create weak wool, Phil, it'll fall off in the field. And we showed very clearly that that's not the case, and we understand why it's not the case. It's just to do with the way fibres break and how many fibres you pull on at any one time. So they were the two major breakthroughs. I was a little bit worried when I did this slide, because it was just when Donald Trump had been shot, and I was a bit worried about Googling what are the best bullets. But the Australian Federal Police haven't contacted me, so it seems to be okay. Now, where are we? This is the bit that's new. What's new now is we're well and truly on the way to getting the injectable. That's really exciting. We're not there yet, but we're well on the way towards getting that target hit. What we then need is the engineers to step up. And I noticed I'm down to talk about engineering, and I'm not an engineer, but these guys have been engaged by AWI. They have experience in sheep handling, and they have experience in robots and robotics, and they are all being commissioned with the task of coming up with either a handheld device which could be used by unskilled labour, small groups of sheep, or a more complex automated system with automatic fleece classing and so on that I talked about. But they all had to address sheep delivery, sheep restraint, sheep positioning, wool removal, wool in-shed processing and pressing, with a due date for their first prototypes, by December this year. This is a fast-track project. These guys are all looking at different mechanisms, you know, whether it's mechanical. Oh, there's a flashing thing, I better hurry. Whether it's mechanical or whether it's using air vortices to break the fibres, and so on. They're all on track for that. Now, I just want to show you this. This is a sheep whose fleece had been made weak the time that we gave it the zane. That machine that's doing it does not have a comb and cutter. That is a reciprocating set of fingers going up and down at high speed. And the wool peels off the front like peeling an orange. Now, this is 2009 we did this, 15 years ago. So why haven't we done anything since? We hadn't had the breakthrough. We now have the breakthroughs which allow us to do that with a single injection. And we're well on the way towards making that work. What you can also notice in the last 1 minute and 42 seconds that I have is that what's left behind is a perfectly even lot of wool. It's absolutely dead uniform because every follicle that was growing the day that we treated was hit and made weak. That means every fibre breaks at exactly the same point. No second cuts, no shearing cuts, no skin pieces in the wool. The udder, or the fibre length in the top, is more uniform. There's less noil, which is being lost as a low product wool quality product. If that doesn't excite you, then you're not very interested in wool, because this is a major step change for this industry. Now, when we got to this point and we started to talk about it a bit, I expected merino wool producers to be contacting me every day, and lots of them have. And I have lots of discussions about this technology. But the people who most contact me are sheep meat producers. And the reason for that is shearing's costing them more than the wool's worth. And they want me to get the wool to fall off in the field now. So I've spent 20 years making sure the wool doesn't fall off in the field, like BioClip would have done. And now they want me to make it fall off in the field. But we think we've got a way of working with the meat breeds, and we're working on ideas there. So thanks for listening. I just want to summarise that this is research. And while I get very excited up here, you guys on the ground want to know how much it costs and when's it going to happen, and should I build a new shearing shed or wait? All of those things. And the answer to a lot of those is I cannot tell you at this point, but we are working towards making this as cheap as possible. And we're making it as accessible as possible, whether it's every farmer owns a machine or whether it's a contract machine comes around. We don't know at this stage. But I think, watch this space. This is an opportunity for the wool industry to jump and catch up with those other industries that I talked about before. Thanks.
So much. Thank you so much, Phil. We're out of time for questions, but it's a game changer, isn't it?
Absolutely. If we can get it all to come together, and don't underestimate pulling together that stuff. Thanks.
Perfect. That wasn't a question. I was told no questions, but we just wedged one in, just a sneaky one. Please, let's have a round of applause for all of those fantastic presentations.